Good morning.
Hi, Bill. Thanks for making the journey. So you've been in the UK this week.
That's correct.
Among other things, advising the UK government. Tell us what you've been telling them.
I was asked by the Prime Minister to come over and take a look at the gang problem that has now spread from the United States into the United Kingdom. And so over the last week, I've been up to Manchester, Birmingham, here in London, being briefed on the gang problem as you see it, and comparing that with the situation that we had in particularly Los Angeles. Gang problems in Boston, New York, but Los Angeles is the major problem area in the United States, and a lot of what you're seeing here in the British Isles is a manifestation, a duplication, or a copycat of that particular problem.
So what can be done?
A lot, actually. Good news for those of you who live here is that this first generation problem here, which is now in its fourth and fifth generation in Los Angeles, is being addressed very enthusiastically by not only the British police services, but by the many other partners that have to work on this issue. It is a networked effort to deal with this problem that, if not dealt with while it's small, can grow very exponentially as it did in the United States. And in this country in particular, with your very low levels of violence and your history of unarmed police, it's not a type of violence that can be allowed to continue. Good news is there's a lot of lessons learned from the United States. Los Angeles will reduce that crime problem significantly. But the creativity and the enthusiasm I found this past week, I briefed the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary on it yesterday, that good news is that it's not being ignored and it's being addressed at an appropriate time while it's still in its nascent stage before it grows.
So how does it come from your briefing to putting it into practice? What are they planning to do?
They will be issuing a report in the next several weeks about their review of the problem and the efforts that they're going to make moving forward. Some of the findings of a day-long conference that was held yesterday, a number of experts from around the world who are sharing the experience came in to talk about what they're doing, met with a lot of the British police leadership and community leadership. So there'll be a major report issued by the Home Secretary in the coming weeks that will be the blueprint for how they intend to move forward.
So among other things, whilst you've been here, I think you've been testifying before the Home Affairs Select Committee, talking about, in part, the London riots that spread to other cities. How can we be prepared for next time this is going to happen? How can the authorities preempt such riots?
Actually, the good news, if there's good news to come out of those riots, is that they happen now and not next year. That if they were to have occurred in the middle of the Olympics, the British police services would have been stretched very thin policing that event, and to then have had to have handled multiple riots across the country, it would have been a very different situation than what just occurred. Quite clearly, the social network, the network world that we now live in, played a significant role in both the activities of those who engaged in the riots, those who were watching it, the reporting of it, and it will be very closely reviewed as to that new element to the disturbance, riot type of situation for policing. It is truly a whole new world, dealing with these flash mob types of issues, the idea of the social media encouraging people to come in, the debate about whether police should, working with the companies that control these networks, to shut them down during a riot, which I have advised against. The idea that, sure, you might stop the ability for the criminal element to communicate with each other, but the vast majority of people who are worried about loved ones, who need to communicate. We've seen this week BlackBerry. I'm based out of New York. I'm here in London. My BlackBerry's not working, and you really start having anxiety attacks that you're trying to run your company, you're trying to plan travel. Like many of you, I live out of the BlackBerry. I don't travel with a computer, I travel with the BlackBerry. So I was literally firsthand, what would it be like to be out of touch? I also was living in New York City on September 11th, and the anxiety, phones went down, an ability to connect with friends who work down at the World Trade Center, certainly being the former commissioner of the NYPD, many of my colleagues, former colleagues down there. That whole anxiety of the world we now live in, it's so networked, and all of a sudden those networks were severed. It is a truly frightening experience. So I've advised against a rush to shut the networks down. Let's take a much closer look at it. If there's an ability to selectively shut phones, et cetera, down, that might be the way to go, but not a broad shutting off.
You've always seen tracking data in great detail as a way to preempt crime, to understand who's causing the crime, to spot the pattern. You set up a system when you were in New York, CompStat. So tell us how that worked and what the learnings were.
CompStat, C-O-M-P-S-T-A-T, 8 letters, back in the good old days of Tandy Radio Shack computers. To identify a program, you only had 8 digits. So computer statistics became CompStat, now world famous and used worldwide by police. It is a system of 4 elements. Timely, accurate intelligence. Gather your intelligence as quickly as you can. Back then, it meant basically having 75 precincts fax in to headquarters every day for collation their crime information. And the acquisition of a Radio Shack Tandy computer was the state of art of technology in 1994 in the NYPD to collate it more quickly. So what do you want that information for? In the case of police, you want to be able to put cops on the dots, those emerging patterns and trends that you're identifying on a now today instantaneous basis. Back then, might take you days or weeks to identify growing patterns and trends. So it's cops on the dots, effective tactics, what works, what doesn't work to deal with that identified crime problem. And lastly, relentless follow-up, that you're constantly scanning to make sure it's not coming back. Think of it as a cancer on your skin. You go to the doctor, timely, accurate intelligence, does a biopsy, you've got cancer. Rapid response, he diagnoses and prescribes chemo, radiation, effective tactics, has you go in, you get it taken care of, and then relentless follow-up. For the next 5 years, he checks you out every 6 months to make sure that the cancer has not come back. That's CompStat. We use it in everyday life. McDonald's everyday CompStats. How many hamburgers did we sell last night? Timely, accurate intelligence. We deliver the new supply tomorrow. Effective tactics, how do we market to sell more? And relentless follow-up, is our marketing and advertising working? Works in your social life. You're a pretty young-looking group here. Probably be in the lounge here tonight. Timely, accurate intelligence, you look down the other end of the bar, catch somebody's eye. Timely, accurate intelligence. Rapid response, you send a drink down or you send yourself down. Effective tactics, you talk her up or talk him up. And relentless follow-up. The next day, you actually use the phone number or the email now in today's modern age that you were given to follow up. CompStat, it was that simple. People ask, geez, why didn't you think of that before? Who knows? Why did it take us so long to invent the electric light bulb?
I'm going to be careful how I follow up on that question. But you've also used it for predictive policing.
Yes, actually what's going on now, the evolution in my world, in my former world, but it's also the same in my new world of business intelligence, risk management, risk compliance, is the idea of the use of information. In policing, we did not use our crime information to direct our resources. And that was what we began to do in 1994 in New York with the dramatic turnaround of crime within 2 years. Crime in New York City now is down for almost 20 straight years, and we're down again this year. I took the system because it is transferable to Los Angeles. Very different city, very different patient, very different crime problem. But like the internal combustion engine in a car, it works in different areas, different models. And we have moved from a community policing era in the 1990s where we first began to focus on preventing crime. We moved after 9/11, the tragedy of 9/11, into the information intelligence age, the need to quickly gather huge amounts of information, and out of that make intelligence. All these fusion centers, the National Terrorism Threat Center, it's all about digesting information and making intelligence actionable intelligence. We are now moving from that era in policing and indeed in terrorism. What are you actually trying to do with that information? You're trying to predict where something is going to occur so you can prevent it. Better to prevent a terrorist attack than respond to it. Better to prevent a rape, a murder, a robbery than to respond to it. And as far-fetched as it might seem, and you might remember the old Tom Cruise movie, Minority Report, how far-fetched that seemed a few years ago, moving all those things around the board. Now every one of you has an iPad, you can do the same damn thing. In policing, the idea is to now start using that information, working with universities, developing algorithms that we in fact can predict with great likelihood when and where a crime is going to occur and move our police resources in there to prevent it.
To give us an example of how pre-crime prediction
I'll give you two examples. One very basic, in my old world in Los Angeles, gangs. Gangs every year celebrate their birth date, when they began. And they all gather together to party, and usually when they get together, even amongst themselves, they'll end up committing acts of violence against each other. Or the rival gangs, knowing it's their anniversary date and where they're going to be, good opportunity to do a good old-fashioned drive-by. And so knowing that, police, we position our police to effectively prevent that from happening by preventing one gang from going after another, by interrupting the behavior. In a more significant fashion, the idea of monitoring the social networks to see that activity is increasing between the gangs or the flash mob type of activity. So watching that, the ability in New York City, for example, there's a craze of bicyclists twittering each other, and all of a sudden you get 1,000 of them show up in Times Square, and then for the next couple of hours ride en masse through the city, tying up traffic and disrupting the normalcy of New York on a Friday night, if Friday night is ever normal in New York. But with the police predictive capabilities, they can move resources very quickly to deal with that issue. Those are just two examples, and the recent events in London, another example of watching the flow of people based on the traffic that's going on in the network that they're all operating on.
What about our civil liberties? If you are out there monitoring what we're doing on the social networks and presuming we're going to be guilty of something, you're going to get the wrong people, aren't you?
It's all basically open space, if you will, that my company, Kroll, we're one of the leading companies in the world using open source information to find out about you or the company that you work for. An example, a business person, a bank comes to us, Goldman Sachs, and we want to buy this company. And we want you to take a look at this company. We want to look at the top executives. And through open source information, we own tens of millions of pages of newspapers. We can match up a company or a person's name against a whole list of words: felon, pervert, bankruptcy. How close is that word to the person's name or the company's name? It's part of open source information. The networks that all of this information is traveling through are by and large open source as far as access from public authorities to basically watch and monitor.
But anybody
we can't do it in the sense of closed sources, or what's the same as in my company's business, I cannot inquire of your criminal history record without you authorizing us to inquire as part of a pre-employment application. So it is really both for the private sector, my world now, open source with authorization to go private. In the public sector, open source with the laws that are in fact currently available to us in our respective countries, the ability to either through warrants or other means access that information. And indeed, the world is, the previous speaker talking about how the world is changing, that in looking at job applicants, in my former capacity as a police chief, used to look at the application, send cops out to talk to the neighbors. First thing we do now is go to the social networks. What are you talking about yourself on Facebook? And this absolute foolishness that young people put on those Facebooks is going to cost them for the rest of their lives, because it's there forever. The stupid pictures they post and the information they put about themselves. They don't think anything about it on a Friday night when they're drunk as a skunk and posting all that stuff. But I'm going to think about it on Monday when I'm looking to hire them in my company, because it's going to harm them for the rest of their lives. It's one of the negative impacts of having too much access to instantaneously do something that's going to be with you forever, because it never disappears. You can't get rid of it.
I take it you're not on Facebook?
I am not, and I don't respond. So I have on my BlackBerry this morning 5 of those friend messages. I want to friend you, and 3 of them are for people I'm very close to who are just now doing it. I will drop them an email through the old-fashioned channel. Here's my email address, but I'm not going to respond to them and then basically end up on their Facebook.
Anybody who's Googled their name will find...
I do have a Facebook page in my company, but not a personal one. Yeah.
Anybody who's Googled their name will find that some of the information out in the open internet that you're trawling is not always accurate.
Wikipedia, when I look at Wikipedia, that in terms of the misinformation, you could spend weeks basically trying to straighten out the misinformation.
But I don't like the idea that the cops, the authorities, the security services, the private companies are seeing that as a way to track me, to hassle me.
You can be tracked all the time. That BlackBerry you're carrying around, every time you hit a repeater site, you're being tracked. That EasyPass. If you're having an affair, you better not be using EasyPass, because when your wife or your husband comes after you for divorce proceedings, all they have to do is get your EasyPass account, and they'll be able to find out where you were just about any time of the day or night.
That's the card that pays toll
That's the card that actually here in London, you have that in the most surveyed city in the world, surveilled city in the world. There is probably not 10 minutes of your time that you're not on some camera somewhere.
I just want to ask you about the broken windows theory.
Here right now?
1982, famous article in the Atlantic magazine, James Wilson, George Kelling, that if you fix the little things in a city, the broken windows, you'd stop the bigger crime. You know, it was all about social norms and conformity, about monitoring, about social signaling. So when you were head of the New York Police Department, you put this in practice.
That's correct.
And you were credited with cutting crime by going for the minor crimes. But since then, there have been a lot of other interpretations about why crime has fallen. So Freakonomics said it wasn't about going for the broken windows, it was because legalized abortion meant there were fewer troublemaking 18-year-olds.
Sold a lot of books.
Sociologists have also said it was because you were targeting ethnic minorities, so that was racist. So did you get it wrong?
Not at all. In terms of the tens of thousands of New Yorkers who are not dead now, because we cut the homicide rate by, now in New York, about 80%. The millions of people who are not the victims of crime since 1990, because we basically prevented that crime, they're not too concerned. Broken windows was a theory that I had lived in the 1970s as a young policeman, so when it was written about in Atlantic Monthly, George Kelling and Jim Wilson are very close friends and colleagues. It resonated with me. It is the idea in a country that loves gardening that if you don't weed the garden's going to die. In a city, if you don't pay attention to situations in the street that people see every day, garbage is not picked up, graffiti, street prostitution, gangs in the corner, drinking all night, cars, abandoned cars that are not picked up, that's signs of urban decay, that nobody's in charge, and it empowers people to think that they can commit crime without fear of being deterred. Going into the tube, not paying your fare, a significant problem in the early 1990s. Malcolm Gladwell, the famous book Tipping Point, was based on an article in New Yorker magazine. It was based on his observing every day when he went into the subway, there were more and more people not paying the fare. And that was the idea that created Tipping Point, that if you don't address it, it reaches a point where, like a disease, it expands exponentially. But the good news, as he talked about in Tipping Point, in which we have dealt with in crime in New York and Los Angeles and elsewhere, is like a disease. If you reach a point where you come up with a solution or a medicine, it will just as exponentially decline. So it increased for 20 years in New York, increased for 30 years in LA, but then when we tipped it back with police tactics, aggressive police tactics, CompStat, it just as quickly declined. So the issue, I'd like to address Freakonomics, because they made a lot of money on that book. The theory that somehow or another, that because abortion became very prevalent, that, and particularly in the populations where so much of the crime is committed and so many of the victims reside, which is in our minority populations, that that was the principal cause or a significant cause of crime reduction. Well, if that was the case, what about birth control, which became widely practiced 20 years before abortion? There should have been, based on that theory, a significant decline across all ethnic groups when birth control came into practice in the 50s or 60s. So the theory didn't hold. That's the same as it was a theory that lead paint, when they started taking lead paint out of public housing developments, that people became less crazy, so there were fewer characters running around. No, the cause of crime is people. There are things that influence it, like an economy, poor economy. But we're seeing in this poor economy, we're not seeing significant rises in crime in my country as a result of the economy. It's because police are controlling behavior to such an extent, we've changed it. And that's the good news. Much as the world that you're here to hear about, the wired world is changing, that the world I came from is also changing for the better. Also, in many respects, because of the use of the technology, cyberspace. I've got a book coming out in January with Harvard professor Collaborate or Perish. It is 20 case studies of how in this wired, now wireless network world, that if you don't collaborate across traditional boundaries in business, in my former world of policing, in the many worlds you operate in, collaboration has to be thought of outside the box. The old way of doing things, the previous speaker talking about how the world is evolving. Collaboration is key to all of it. If you don't collaborate, you're literally going to perish. You're going to go out of business. You're just not going to survive.
Bill Bratton, super cop, advisor to governments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.